Control and Control is one of Magic's most acquired tastes, and it's also one of my favorite things to watch and play, which is why I made a whole video on Wafo-Tapa's blue-black block constructed teachings deck. But looking through the comments of that video made one thing pretty clear. There was a lot of demand to see a deeper dive into Wafo-Tapa's actual games in Yokohama. Like a lot of demand. Like a lot. So I booted up my livestream right here on YouTube and spent a few hours going over, in detail, the control mirrors that led to him becoming a Pro Tour champion. Without further ado, let's take a closer look at how Wafo-Tapa conquered the control decks of Pro Tour Yokohama 2007. After a 5-game quarterfinal against Paulo Carvalho's red-green deck, Wafo-Tapa finds himself in the semi-finals, facing off against America's own Mark Herberholz. Heezy is a fairly recent Pro Tour champion and has followed up his strong finish from Honolulu 2006 with a top 4 appearance here. Unlike the red-green aggro deck that saw Heezy triumph in Honolulu, he and his team have correctly identified the power of blue-black control in this block-constructed format. The decks they're both playing are pretty similar to each other, but there are enough key differences that they're worth looking over a bit more closely. I'll leave the decks on screen for a while here as I talk through them because there is a lot to take in. Both players have a good amount of lands, with Heezy having 1 extra in his main deck and both having 2 in their sideboards, which they'll both need for colors in the postboard games, but having some extra land lying around is actually good in matchups where you want to hit as many lands as possible. The specific lands are where a bigger difference is made though, as Mark has an extra storage land, which is a huge advantage in the mirror, and he also has a second Urza's Factory, which we'll talk about the significance of more later. Guillaume, on the other hand, has a very clean mana base, including an Urza's Factory and an Academy Ruins to help recur his Triskelevis, which is especially useful in games that go long. They both have the same number of copies of Mystical Teachings in the main, although Mark does have 1 more in the sideboard, as well as the same number of Draining Works and Cancels, pretty stock tools in these decks. They also both have some wasted space in their main decks between 4 Damnations and some of their removal spells. Tendrils of Corruption is actually alright in this matchup, as it can take out a Teferi and buy you a lot of time if you're getting pressured by assembly worker tokens and the like, but for the most part, the anti-creature stuff both players have isn't too useful in this first game. Mark's white cards like Teferi's Moat and Temporal Isolation being in his main deck are arguably worse than some of Guillaume's, but his Pull from Eternity is a pretty good teachings target, so I'd say it's all mostly a wash. Both players have a Haunting Hymn for hand disruption as well as access to Extirpate. Mark does have a main deck Extirpate and more in his sideboard for those games, which can be decent tools here, but are also a bit hard to utilize effectively in a lot of places. Otherwise, this is a very classic control on control fight. Making land drops matters because having more resources than your opponent is essential, especially when bigger counterwars break out over key spells. And as always, you're mostly looking to force the action on your opponent on their end step so you can trade off some resources and then untap and spend all your refresh lands on something you care about even more. Once you're consistently applying pressure on board while leaving mana open, you can force your opponent to flinch first and then try and leverage that situation to grind out an even bigger advantage. As we'll see, a lot of this idea comes to fruition mostly in the form of lands, especially in the only pre-sideboarded game. So the game begins and both players start playing mana sources, each opening with a storage land. Note that Guillaume plays his Prismatic Lens intentionally a turn delayed so he can still charge his Dreadship Reef. That's how valuable those storage counters are. While both players spend time building up reserves of mana, Wafo-Tapa finally makes the first step towards any sort of progress in the game when he deploys his 1 and only copy of Urza's Factory. It might not look like much, but paying 7 mana and tapping your factory to make a 2/2 at instant speed is actually highly relevant here, especially since lands can't be counted, and in game 1, neither player has a way to destroy a land. While Mark has a lot of time to find one of his 2 copies of Factory to cancel Wafo's out, or just find another route to win this game. If left unchecked, the Factory is going to make a steady enough stream of robots that Mark will be pressured to do something or just lose. So believe it or not, even though both players only have a bunch of lands in play, Wafo-Tapa is right now winning this game. So Mark decides something has to be done about this. Previously in this game, he'd cast a Mystical Teachings to get another one, a standard play for an extra tutor and some eventual card advantage, but this time he cast the Teachings to get one of the better silver bullets versus control, Haunting Hymn. This 6 mana instant makes your opponent discard 2 cards, but if you cast it in one of your main phases, your opponent has to discard 4 cards instead. In a matchup where card advantage is a real difference maker, not only because you want to adequately defend against threats and protect your own, but also because hitting land drops matters, getting 4 for 1 isn't a great deal. So Heezy puts the hymn on the stack, and this results in the first big counter war. First, Guillaume casts Teachings for a cancel, Herberholz cancels back, Wafo-Tapa responds with the cancel in his hand, and Mark has the last laugh with another cancel, taking out the rest of Wafo-Tapa's hand and leaving himself with 2 copies of Mystical Teachings in his graveyard. Both players don't have a lot left, but the way is now clear for Mark Herberholz to try and get ahead in this game, which is good because he's still trying to fight off the Urza's Factory. My hot take? I actually don't think this hymn matters that much here, especially in game 1. Both players are pretty threat light, Both players have a bunch of anti-creature cards they can't really use, clogging up their decks, and each player using half of their best counterspells to fight over a card that does something in the immediate future doesn't seem all that good when this game is practically destined to go ultra late.
So somehow Guillaume seems to be winning this game. He lost the big counter war. It's just all Urza's Factory is just that relevant.
Wafo-Tapa also responds beautifully here by taking a turn off from using his factory to flashback the mystical teachings he cast earlier to restock his hand with another teachings. This timing is important because he knows Mark has a main deck Extirpate, and mystical teachings is the one card you basically can't afford to lose. So in order to prevent his teachings from getting permanently removed, and because the number of threats Mark can follow up with is pretty low, he feels safe enough to tap a bit lower on lands in order to save his deck's card advantage engine. Heezy, now with those two teachings in his bin that aren't vulnerable and still staring down the Urza's Factory token, uses one to tutor up an Extirpate for later before untapping and casting a Careful Consideration in his main phase. Again, players do need to be keeping up with their cards in this matchup, and Wafo-Tapa has drawn pretty well since getting Haunting Hymned. After Wafo-Tapa makes another token with his factory and swings in for 4 damage, Heezy takes this moment to make a move. And I actually think this is the play that ultimately loses Mark Herberholt's game 1. He decides to use his only main deck Extirpate to remove the rest of Wafo-Tapa's cancels. Generally not a bad plan, as cutting off 2 of the 4 remaining permission spells seems pretty good, but the main questions to consider are, what can this let Mark actually force through this game that matters, because that's the reason to remove permission, and even more notably, is there a target that's more important than this that he'd need to save his Extirpate for? I think the answer to these are no, there's nothing Mark can really force through that matters, because both players are so threat light that he's pretty much committed to the double factory plan working out this game, and yes, he needs to save his Extirpate for exactly one card, and that card isn't cancel. It's Triskelivis. Triskelivis is an interesting magic card, an ode, like many cards in Time Spiral block, to Triskelion and Tetravis, 2 classic Antiquities artifacts. Like Tetravis, it's an artifact creature that comes into play with +1/+1 counters and makes little 1/1 flyers, as you can pay 1 mana to remove a counter and make a Triskelivite token. The Triskelion part comes from the tokens themselves, as the little flying Mog Fanatics can sacrifice themselves to ping any target for a single point of damage. A 7 mana 4/4 flyer that can split into little flyers doesn't sound all that good, and if that's all it was, I don't think it would be. While the fact that it split into smaller flyers did help against sudden death, which was a powerful removal spell even in this matchup, as Split Second meant it was especially good at dealing with Teferi, but also meant you couldn't afford to wait to take the counters off and give your opponent a priority window, something that Guillaume is aware of all match long, always taking the maximum number of counters off that he can as soon as his creature resolves. No, the big issue here stems from Guillaume's other utility land, the one he's playing instead of a second Urza's Factory, Academy Ruins. Wafo-Tapa can only recur this Triskelivis or his Prismatic Lenses, and spoiler alert, one of these targets is a lot better than the other. The funny thing is, Wafo-Tapa said before the top 8 that Ruins is one of the few cards he wanted to change in his deck, wishing, like Herberholtz, that he had another Urza's Factory.
On the back of Triskelivis and Academy Ruins, cards he said before the top 8, these are the cards I would change in my deck. They're the ones I don't like. I would rather have another Urza's Factory.
While I'm nowhere near as good as Guillaume, I actually think he's wrong on this one, as Triskelivis is such a great recursive threat, and one that can reasonably keep up with a factory or two, seeing as the flyers can punch through in the air and are really challenging to tendrils, as the little tokens can be sacrificed at instant speed. They even give you a tiny bit of direct damage to end games with. While we do have to troll the text coverage to find this out, as the coverage cuts away from this slow control mirror to the other semi-final during this elongated first game, a recursive Triskelivis is basically the reason Guillaume ends up winning the opener, as both players just run out of threats, and even though Herberholtz finds his second factory, Wafo-Tapa's early assembly workers do their damage, and Triskelivis is able to finish off the game. I think without Academy Ruins, this game is a lot more challenging for Guillaume, but with it, especially when Herberholtz burnt his only Extirpate on some cancels, Guillaume was always going to have the late game in the bag. When you have this many lands and this much mana, I think Triskelivis is way better. So, it's funny that Wafo-Tapa said he would rather have a second factory, but I think his Academy Ruins actually wins him game 1. And thankfully, we don't have to worry about this anymore, because we're now in a completely different environment. Before we continue, I just want to take a quick second to plug the channel's Patreon. If you're a fan of the content here at Hungry on Plane and want to support it more directly, Patreon is one of the best ways to do so. For a small monthly fee, you get access to the exclusive Discord, any extra content that gets made that doesn't make it to the channel, and your insight into what's coming up next, among other things. Rest assured, the content will always be free here on YouTube, but if you feel like showing some additional support, here's a way you can do that. Alright, back to the video. Like Stream Me from the past just said, mercifully the environment in the postboard games is very different, because players get access to more colors in their sideboards and get to take out some of their dead cards for better ones, including what now becomes the most important card in the matchup. The decks are the suspend creature, Detridivore. Not to oversimplify too much, but Detritivore vs Pool from Eternity is basically the whole matchup now. You just can't reasonably win a game if you get your key utility and storage lands exploded. The mana advantage is too great to put up a fight against Teferi or whatever win condition your opponent will eventually end up throwing at you. Draining Welk is your best way out of the long game, as resolving a big Welk early does give you a large enough threat to reasonably win behind, but Welk is also good in the reverse situation, if you're squeezing your opponent's mana and force them to tap low into your incoming flash creature. Game 2 unfortunately didn't have the start of it make it onto coverage, as the other semi-final was ending, and as we pop back, we can see Wafo-Tapa once again smashing face with Triskaelivis and friends. Although this game does come with an interesting wrinkle. Herberholz is the one with the active Detritivore ticking away, and the Academy Ruins got destroyed already, which shuts off the recursion seen in Game 1. Wafo-Tapa has correctly identified that he is the beatdown this game now, and did have Triskaelivis recursion going for a while, but now that that's been broken up, he's gonna have to try and close out this game before Heezy's Factory and Detritivore start rumbling in. Strangely, in a control and control mirror, the race is now on, as both players are making little creatures to beat each other up with. Wafo-Tapa's little creatures though both fly in for 4 every turn and have some extra reach built in if they're sacrificed, so Herberholz doesn't have long. We reach a point where Tendrils of Corruption threatens to turn the race around for Heezy, so he bluffs it. But it doesn't actually end up mattering, because if Heezy makes a move, he's going to get shot by the Triskaelivite tokens and perish. If he tries to shoot the main body of the construct, you can still ping it with a token, denying any life gain. Funnily enough, Mark does actually draw the tendrils, but not before realizing that Guillaume has elegantly played around it with how he used his Triskaelivites and closes out Game 2. So just barely, Wafo-Tapa uses the Triskaelivis and Academy Ruins he apparently didn't want in his deck to take back-to-back games despite Heezy having Detritivore. Game 3 sees Herberholz sit up in his chair and put his hat backwards, so you know he means business. The first major moment in this game comes when Wafo-Tapa suspends an Aeon Chronicler and Mark responds with a Pool from Eternity, creating 6 mana for 1, which is a great deal for Herberholz. The problem is that Guillaume has a Detritivore as his follow-up, threatening to take out Heezy's only storage land. Mark does have a follow-up Pool from Eternity on his turn, but not before he uses Guillaume's end step to Teachings Up and Extirpate, hilariously taking out Wafo-Tapa's Triskaelivis from his graveyard and finally removing the potent late game threat from causing problems this game.
Looks like he's going to Mystical Teachings for an Extirpate.
Ah. What does he extirpate here?
Let's see, what is here?
Get rid of Triskaelivis. Get that thing out of here. I'm tired of losing to it. Gone.
Still, Mark isn't in a great spot here. All of his pools are now gone, and Wafo-Tapa still has 2 Detritivores somewhere in his deck to bring the hammer down on this game. Things go from bad to worse as Mark taps low at the end of his turn to charge up his storage lands, and Wafo-Tapa responds by sliding a Teferi into play, something that threatens to find the game-winning Detritivore if Guillaume has a Teachings. Mark at least responds with a Haunting Him to take most of Wafo-Tapa's toys away before playing an Aeon Chronicler as a blocker for Teferi a few turns later. Wafo-Tapa though finds his own Haunting Him, which not only makes Herberholz hellbent, but kills off the Chronicler as well. Heezy is then forced to flashback a Teachings in order to find a sudden death for the Teferi that's still applying pressure, and we enter a top deck war with Mark at a somewhat precarious 8 life. Still, with Herberholz no longer being able to fight off future Detritivores and Guillaume having a second Teferi lurking somewhere in his deck, the long game prospects do not look good for Mark. So when Guillaume fires off a careful consideration, Mark responds with a recently top-decked Draining Welk to make a 5/5 flyer, a threat that's large enough to end the game before Guillaume's late game position can take over. Wafo-Tapa responds with a Tendrils to shoot the Welk, but Heezy also has a cancel to protect his creature, and with the opposing Blue Mage now out of cards, Mark finally takes the game by beating down with his timely illusion as Guillaume fails to top deck an answer in time. Game 4 begins with the same first inflection point as Wafo-Tapa suspends an early Aeon Chronicler, which is met once again with a Pool from Eternity. Guillaume follows up again with an early Detritivore, and this time Herberholz does not have the second pool to answer back, already being on the back foot in terms of mana development, which is not where you want to be in the mirror. Even though it's only suspended for 1, Detritivore eats Mark's Dreadship Reef, which he floats a blue off of before it goes bye-bye. Using that extra mana, he decides there's not much downside to just casting the Teachings he has available and being mana efficient, and unfortunately, this happens to be a grave error. Guillaume slams a Draining Welk into play to punish this, and now Mark is floundering, losing both in total resources and now board presence, as Wafo-Tapa is seemingly now the aggro and the control deck at the same time. A second Detritivore doesn't look to make things any easier, and in lightning fast fashion for the mirror at least, Guillaume wins Game 4 in a matter of turns and moves on to the finals. This series was a great back and forth between 2 elite players, but I'd say the thing that most impressed me about Guillaume was how well he understood all the minute positions in this game. He He knew when to play for late and lean on his recursion, while also being quick to identify windows where he could sneak through a threat and start applying pressure. Wafo-Tapa is one of the most patient control players ever, but that doesn't mean he always does nothing, and his greatest skill might be knowing just how much something he can get away with at any given moment. So the finals are now set, with France's Wafo-Tapa playing his teachings deck and Japan's Kazuya Mitamura on another blue-black control deck. Mitamura is one of many accomplished Japanese pros from the early 2000s and has a top 8 in this era from as recently as Pro Tour Charleston in 2006. Even though this matchup is billed as a control mirror, it plays very, very differently from the semifinals. See, Mitamura's deck not only has 0 copies of Mystical Teachings in it, but he has so many creatures, and they are all big threats in this matchup. Fully 4 copies of Shadowmage Infiltrator, the invitational card of the one and only John Finkel, which basically cannot be allowed to live at any point in this matchup, lest it run away with the game with how many extra cards it gives Mitamura. But also a pair of creatures that to me is just delightful, because it's one of my favorite standard combos of all time, the Pickles Lock. Named for the role Brine Elemental plays in the combo, the Pickles Lock involves 2 creatures combining to prevent your opponent from untapping ever again. I'll let past streamer me explain the combo in a bit more detail. Brine Elemental is where the sauce gets really spicy. So Brine Elemental is a morph, obviously. You can unmorph it for 7. 5 blue, that is a lot of mana, 7 mana. To unmorph a 5/4, it's not even that big, it's pretty big, it's a 5/4 pretty big creature. But when you unmorph Brine Elemental, your opponent skips their next untap step. It is a one-sided stasis when you unmorph Brine Elemental. Now that is pretty good on its own. When you combine it with Vesuvian Shapeshifter, you can unmorph Vesuvian Shapeshifter, getting the Brine Elemental unmorph ability, which is to make your opponent skip their untap step. Then in your upkeep, you can turn the Vesuvian Shapeshifter back down, and then next turn you can unmorph it again. And now you see what we're doing. There is a combo between these 2 cards where if you have Shapeshifter and Brine Elemental in play, you can lock your opponent out of the game indefinitely. They will never get another untap step. So yeah, Wafo-Tapa has a lot of tools to deal with creatures, which is good, because Mitamura has a ton of threatening ones, but if he's ever able to land the Pickles combo, Guillaume is going to lose games from that position about 99% of the time. And game 1 is perfectly illustrative of how the matchup goes. Even though they're 2 blue-black decks with some overlapping tools, Guillaume is the defender, and Mitamura is the aggressor. We see this immediately as Kazuya Mitamura runs out a Shadowmage Infiltrator on the 3rd turn of the game, and Wafo-Tapa responds by casting a Damnation to sweep it off the board. Just one creature is scary enough to justify investing 4 mana to take it out, especially in the earlier stages of this game, and this is a trend that will continue all match long. Case in point, after Mitamura plays land number 6 and lays out a single morph creature, Wafo-Tapa drops an Urborg and sends that face-down creature to the Shadow Realm with another Damnation. Right after, Kazuya goes to play yet another morph and defends it from Guillaume's cancel with one of his own, to which Wafo-Tapa just shrugs and casts Teachings for Tendrils to deal with the morph threat, and they just keep coming. Even though Mitamura gets hit by haunting him after his morph sticks, Mitamura is able to turn the tides a little and play a top deck Shadowmage Infiltrator, which he then copies with the Shapeshifter he played the last turn. But Wafo-Tapa is not to be deterred and plays out his trusty Triskalavus to stalemate the board, with his creature conveniently being an artifact preventing the fearful Infiltrator from getting through. Both players stare at each other for a few turns until Mitamura finds a very threatening Teferi, but Wafo finds the timely Damnation to reset the game back in his favor, made even better by the fact he recently suspended an Aeon Chronicler for a few counters. Mitamura did have a narrow window or 2 to try and find one of his 2 main deck Brine Elementals, but when no such threat is found, Mitamura gets sent back to the Stone Age by the 3rd copy of the Black Wrath. Even though Mitamura is fighting back with Phyrexian Totem and a Brine Elemental that at least gets to flip before it gets shot by a Tendrils of Corruption, Wafo-Tapa's Aeon Chronicler combined with his powerful Teachings Engine gets him the W in the opening game. Game 2 was much of the same, with Guillaume's removal heavy hand cleanly taking out Mitamura's threats, with multiple morphs being removed at a time with Damnation, as it seemed like Kazuya couldn't quite be patient enough to not get 2 for 1. That, or in trying to overload Wafo-Tapa's single target removal, he walked into the sweeper instead, falling prey to one of the classic blunders. There's still life in Mitamura yet though, as he plays a bit more patiently in the 3rd game. Guillaume is also a little mana screwed early on, having just barely enough lands to Tendrils the Shadowmage Infiltrator before being forced to Damnation the follow-up morph that happened to be a Brine Elemental. Eventually, the still mana screwed but slightly lesser Guillaume is up against Mitamura's Urza's Factory, who curiously uses his storage counters to make a 2/2 at the end of the turn. This prompts Wafo-Tapa to flash a Teferi into play, and all of a sudden, Mitamura's greedy play looks like it might seal this last game for Guillaume. Until Mitamura untaps and plays a card I don't think anyone expected him to still have in. Certainly I didn't.
Oh, Mitamura played a Damnation to get rid of the Teferi.
Why does Minamura have damnation in it? Wait, what? Wait, why does Minamura have damnation in his deck? Wait, it's the only thing that kills Chronicler and Teferi? I guess. Like, Strangling Suit doesn't kill those creatures. He doesn't have sudden death. Seriously? That's very funny. While I might have been surprised at the time, it turns out that with Minamura's removal spells of choice being Strangling Suit and Snapback that were great against the creature decks in the Swiss, they can't interact with Wafo-Tapa's most impactful creature in this matchup. A hilarious but understandable deck building choice that means Kazuya has to leave in a Wrath of God against a blue-black control deck with only 6 creatures in it. He doesn't even have Tendrils in his deck, although he does have a single Urborg to help shore up his mana base a bit, a stark contrast to Wafo-Tapa's 4 copies. But Wafa's mana troubles do continue as Minamura's singular Urborg strip mines Guillaume's 4th land and Primu Black Source thanks to the old champions of Kamigawa era Legend rule. Wafo-Tapa and his prismatic lenses still fight on though, as a Teferi gets in the way of an incoming Phyrexian totem, forcing Minamura to sacrifice a few lands. Guillaume then follows up with a sudden death on the totem, which begs the question, why didn't he do that before Teferi went down? The reason is because Minamura has a face-down morph, which after sideboarding can be a willbender, which is the only way in this game and honestly in this entire format to redirect a split-second removal spell. When the morph is in fact revealed to be a willbender, Guillaume looks like a genius, and when a disenchant takes out the totem and Wafo-Tapa deploys his trusty Triskellos onto an almost empty board, it's looking like a sweep for the French legend. Unfortunately, he didn't have enough to remove any counters from his Triskellos to make Triskellovites, which means you've also just tapped out into an unknown morph when Minamura has a ton of mana in play. Those mana troubles mean Wafo-Tapa has had to take quite a few risks this game, and he finally runs into the Brine Elemental he's been fearing all match. He does respond to the next morph going into play by casting Teachings for Sudden Death to take out the Briny, which insulates him from both Willbender and the potential Shapeshifter from coming down that would lock him out. But Minamura is one step ahead and actually played another Brine Elemental, which he can unmorph thanks to his storage mana and finally lock Guillaume out with the Shapeshifter follow-up the next turn. Wafo-Tapa does find the ingenious line of playing some untapped lands, making 2 Triskellovites and pinging the Shapeshifter in Minamura's upkeep, which means it can't unmorph back into a 2/2 to keep reactivating Brine Elemental's morph ability, which is some galaxy brain level of thinking that I can't believe he found, but sadly, breaking out of the lock for a single turn is still not enough, and Kazuya finally grabs the game with his blue-black Pickles deck. Game 4 begins in very similar fashion to the earlier ones, with Minamura's first 2 on-curve Shadowmage Infiltrators perishing to a cancel and then a damnation on back-to-back turns. After suspending a Chronicler for a few to keep his cards flowing, Wafo-Tapa eliminates the first 2 morphs of the game on back-to-back turns once again, with Tendrils and then Damnation. This game, it's Minamura with the mana troubles though, as Guillaume's land base and hand keep growing, and it seems as though Kazuya just cannot keep up with the Teachings deck. Under the pressure of the impending Chronicler, with only 5 lands in play, Minamura decides to tap out for Teferi to try and stop the Chronicler from coming into play, and runs into the worst possible answer from Guillaume, Draining Wealth. Again, so interesting that Minamura has decided that he wants to play this way, but I feel like it's kind of playing into Wafo-Tapa's hands. Oh, I know exactly what happens here. Game's over. So Minamura decides that he wants to try and prevent the Chronicler from coming off suspend by resolving Teferi, which does stop the creature from coming in. And you know, it's a good threat to present. If it lives, your chances of winning these mirrors go up by quite a lot. Unfortunately, Wafo-Tapa has the Draining Welk.
From Guillaume Wafo-Tapa.
And now he has a 6/6.
That's pretty big.
2 pretty big guys.
It's a 6/6 flyer
and Chronicler comes back. And we start attacking. And I'm pretty sure Guillaume Wafo-Tapa has enough mana left to play the cancel in his hand. And he has 2 copies of T2. Just like the semifinals, Wafo-Tapa paved his way to the finals with a quick Welk, and it's fitting that he wins the last game of the tournament in the exact same way to become the champion of Pro Tour Yokohama. Whew, we went through a lot of Magic in this video, but if this is the kind of content you enjoy, let me know. I had a ton of fun streaming back these games, going through them in more detail, and making this video for those of you that like longer breakdown. If this still wasn't enough for you, the full livestream VOD is available to watch on the channel too, which I'll link in this video's description. Check out the Patreon or Ko-fi if you want to support the channel more directly, and stay tuned to this space for more coverage, stories, and moments from competitive Magic.